When you share your home with someone, you're supposed to know them. You see them at their most vulnerable. You share meals, beds, and daily routines. Proximity creates knowledge, and knowledge creates safety. But for the 10 people in these cases, the person sleeping beside them was actively murdering strangers. Paula Rader spent 34 years married to BTK. Judith Morrison believed she had the perfect husband, while Gary Ridgeway strangled 49 women. Carol Hoff raised her daughters above 26 bodies buried in the crawl space. These weren't relationships with ignored warning signs. These were systematic deceptions maintained for decades. The killers compartmentalized so completely that the people who should have known them best had no idea. They came home after murdering strangers and kissed their wives goodnight. They buried bodies in shared yards and blamed the smell on sewer problems. When the truth emerged, it didn't just end relationships, it destroyed every memory within them, forcing complete reconstruction of lifetimes that had never been what they seemed. Today, we're covering 10 people who lived with serial killers and never knew until the moment of arrest, discovery, or confession. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about how well you can truly know another person. The ultimate betrayal isn't just murder, it's making someone you love complicit through their ignorance. Case 1. Paula Rader. On the morning of February 25, 2005, Paula Rader kissed her husband Dennis goodbye as he left for work at City Hall in Park City, Kansas. It was a Friday. Dennis worked as the compliance officer and animal control supervisor for the city. Paula worked as a bookkeeper. Their daughter Kerry was away at Kansas State University. Their son Brian, born November 30, 1973, had his own life. The house on North Independence Street was quiet. Paula had married Dennis on May 22, 1971, at Christ Lutheran Church, the same church where Dennis now served as president of the congregation. 34 years of marriage, 34 years of shared meals, shared beds, shared routines. Shortly after noon that day, police pulled Dennis over near their home. An officer leaned toward the window. "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" Dennis replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." Paula Rader's entire understanding of her life was about to disintegrate. Dennis Lynn Rader was born March 9, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He met Paula Dietz in the late 1960s. She was born May 5, 1948. They married young and settled into what appeared to be an unremarkable middle-class life in the Wichita area. Dennis worked as an installer at ADT Security Services from 1974 to 1988, which gave him access to homes across Wichita and taught him how security systems worked. In 1991, he took a position with Park City in code enforcement and animal control. He wore a badge, wrote citations for code violations, barking dogs, grass that grew too tall. Neighbours saw him as fastidious about regulations but dedicated. He was active at Christ Lutheran Church, serving as president and as a Cub Scout leader when the kids were young. Paula sang in the choir. They attended potluck dinners, volunteered for church events, helped organise fundraisers. They looked like every other family in Park City. But between January 15, 1974 and January 19, 1991, Dennis Rader murdered 10 people. Every single murder occurred during his marriage to Paula. He gave himself a name, BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. He sent letters to police and media describing his crimes in chilling detail, taunting investigators. He kept trophies in a locked box that sat in their bedroom closet for years. Paula walked past it regularly. She never opened it. The first victims were the Otero family on January 15, 1974. Less than 3 years into his marriage, Rader cut the phone line and broke into the home of Joseph Otero Sr., 38, and his wife Julie, 33. Their children Joseph II, 9, and Josephine, 11, were home. He told the family he was a wanted man who needed their car and money. He was lying. He strangled Joseph the Senior with a cord. He strangled Julie with a belt. He took young Joseph II to his bedroom and put a plastic bag over his head. Then he took Josephine to the basement, hanged her from a pipe, and masturbated while watching her die. She was 11 years old. He went home to Paula afterward. He kissed her. He ate dinner. He slept beside her. 3 months later, on April 4, 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, 21. Her brother Kevin fought back, and Rader shot him in the face. Kevin survived and escaped. Rader stabbed Catherine repeatedly. She died at the hospital. On March 17, 1977, he broke into the home of Shirley Vian, 26. Her 3 young children were home. He locked them in a bathroom and strangled their mother while they waited behind the door. He later wrote a poem about this murder, titled Shirley Locks. It contained the line, "Thou shalt not scream, but lay on cushion and think of me and death." Paula found this poem among Dennis's belongings. When she asked about it, he told her it was a draft for a college creative writing assignment. She believed him. Her husband was taking courses through Wichita State University. Of course he would have writing assignments. On December 8, 1977, he killed Nancy Fox, 25, strangling her with a belt. After she was dead, he called police from a payphone to report the murder himself. He wanted credit. Then came an 8-year gap. On April 27, 1985, he killed Maureen Hedge, 53, who lived down the street. He strangled her, took her body to Christ Lutheran Church, photographed it, then dumped it in a ditch. Paula walked past the locked box containing those photographs regularly. On September 16, 1986, he murdered Vicky Wegerle, 28. She fought desperately. Her DNA ended up under her fingernails. That evidence sat in storage for 15 years. On January 19, 1991, he killed Dolores Davis, 62. He abducted her, strangled her, dumped her body under a bridge. After this, he went silent for 14 years. Paula noticed things during these years, but the explanations always made sense. Dennis kept newspaper clippings about the BTK case. He cut out every article, sometimes marking them with notes in the margins. Paula assumed he was interested like everyone in Wichita. The entire city was terrified of BTK. When BTK's letters were published, showing distinctive misspellings matching Dennis's handwriting, she joked, "You spell just like BTK." Dennis laughed. Paula laughed. It became a running joke between them. The idea that her husband, a church leader and city employee, could actually be BTK was so absurd that the joke was harmless. The locked box sat in their bedroom closet for years. Paula never asked to see inside. In a marriage, you respect certain boundaries. Inside were victims' driver's licenses, pieces of their clothing, underwear, jewellery, and photographs he had taken of bodies posed in bondage positions. In 2004, BTK resumed communication after 13 years of silence. A television story about the unsolved murders frustrated him. People had forgotten. He sent letters and packages to media containing victim items. He wanted attention again. In one letter, Rader asked police whether they could trace a floppy disk. Police responded in a newspaper ad. "Rex, it will be okay." They lied. In February 2005, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to KSAS Fox TV. Forensic analysts examined it immediately. The metadata revealed the last user was named Dennis, and the document had been created at Christ Lutheran Church. This was the break investigators needed. They focused on Dennis Rader, but needed DNA confirmation. They obtained a warrant for daughter Kerry's medical records at Kansas State University. A pap smear showed a familial DNA match to evidence from under Vicky Wegerle's fingernails. Dennis Rader was BTK. On February 25, 2005, officers arrested Dennis. FBI agents arrived at Paula's home with a search warrant. They found the locked box. Paula saw the contents for the first time in 34 years of marriage. Crime scene photographs of women bound and strangled. Driver's licenses, underwear, jewellery. Handwritten notes describing fantasies and planned murders. The box contained the entire hidden life of the man she had slept beside for 34 years. When investigators asked about Dennis, she told them, "He was a good man, a great father. He would never hurt anyone." She was in shock. Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to all 10 counts of first-degree murder on June 27, 2005. During his guilty plea, he described each murder in detail, speaking in a flat monotone. He used the phrase, "putting them down," to describe strangling victims, the same language from his animal control job. On August 18, 2005, Judge Gregory Waller sentenced him to 10 consecutive life sentences, with a minimum of 175 years. Kansas had abolished the death penalty in 1972, so Rader was not eligible for execution. Judge Waller addressed him. "You, sir, are a black hole. You have no light in you." Victims' families gave impact statements. Steve Relford, brother of Vicky Wegerle, said, "There are no words to describe the pain you have caused. You destroyed our family." Beverly Plapp, daughter of Maureen Hedge, said, "You are not a man, you are a monster." Rader sat expressionless. When given a chance to speak, he offered a hollow apology, then complained about media portrayal. Paula was never investigated as a suspect. Detective Tim Relf stated, "Paula is a good and decent person. Her only mistake in life was to care for Dennis Rader." On July 26, 2005, Paula filed for emergency divorce on grounds of emotional stress. Judge Eric Yost granted it the same day, waiving the 60-day waiting period. Dennis signed over all property and retirement benefits. Paula sold their home at auction for $90,000 and left Kansas. She has never visited Dennis in prison, never written to him, never taken his calls, never attended hearings, never given a public interview. Her silence is absolute. Dennis Rader is now 80 years old, incarcerated in solitary confinement at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He will die there. He spends 23 hours a day in his cell, writing letters to anyone who will correspond, still seeking attention, showing no genuine remorse. Their daughter, Kerry Rawson, published a memoir in 2019 titled A Serial Killer's Daughter. She wrote, "My mother sort of dealt with my dad like he died on the day he was arrested. She has PTSD from the events around his arrest." Paula Rader spent 34 years married to a man who strangled 10 people, including 4 children, and she never knew. She cooked his meals. She washed his clothes, possibly clothes stained with victims' blood that he claimed were from animal control work. She shared a bed with him. She raised his children. She trusted him completely. That trust was the perfect cover. Nobody suspects the church leader, the Cub Scout volunteer, the compliance officer. Dennis Rader weaponized normalcy. He used Paula's love and trust as camouflage, and when the mask finally came off, Paula had to reconstruct 34 years of memories, knowing that the man she thought she knew had never existed at all. Paula Rader never opened the locked box where her husband kept his trophies, but the next wife actually helped police search her home in 1987 and still believed her husband was innocent. Case 2. Judith Morrison. In 1985, Judith Lorraine Morrison walked into the White Shutters Tavern in Washington State, looking for a quiet drink after a long week. She was a divorced single mother trying to rebuild her life. That evening at the bar, she met a man named Gary Ridgeway. He was sitting alone, quiet and unassuming. He told her he worked as a spray painter at the Kenworth truck factory in Renton, where he had been employed for decades. He seemed stable, dependable. He seemed genuinely interested in her. They started talking. They exchanged phone numbers. They started dating. For Judith, this felt like her second chance at happiness. What she did not know was that 2 days after they met, Gary Ridgeway was sitting in an interrogation room at the King County Sheriff's Office, being interviewed by Green River Killer Task Force detectives about the murders of nearly 50 women. The detectives questioned him for hours. They let him go. Judith never found out. She fell in love with a man who had already killed more than 40 people. Gary Leon Ridgeway was born February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He had an IQ measured in the low 80s and struggled academically throughout his school years. After high school, he joined the Navy and served during the Vietnam War era. When he returned to civilian life, he found work at the Kenworth truck factory in Renton as a spray painter. He showed up on time every single day for more than 30 years. He married twice before Judith. Both marriages ended in divorce. Both ex-wives later told investigators that Gary had an insatiable sexual appetite and would demand sex multiple times a day. By the time he met Judith in 1985, he had been killing for 3 years. Between 1982 and 1984, Gary Ridgeway killed at least 40 women. Nearly all were sex workers, runaways, or vulnerable women living on the margins. He picked them up along Pacific Highway South, also known as Route 99, which ran through the SeaTac area. The White Shutters Tavern, where Judith met Gary in 1985, was located directly on Highway 99. He was hunting on the same road where he met his future wife. His method was consistent. He would offer women money for sex, He would drive them to secluded areas near the Green River or deep in the forests of South King County. He would have sex with them, then strangle them during or immediately after. After they were dead, he dumped their bodies in remote areas, often returning days or weeks later to have sex with the decomposing remains. Wendy Lee Caulfield was 16 years old when her body was found in the Green River on July 15, 1982. She was the first victim attributed to the Green River killer. Opal Charmaine Mills, also 16, was found in August 1982. Then Cynthia Jean Hines, Marcia Faye Chapman, Carol Ann Christensen. The bodies piled up. Marie Malvar was 18 when she vanished in spring 1983. Her boyfriend and father witnessed her getting into a pickup truck. They followed it but lost it in traffic. They got a partial license plate and reported everything to police. Detectives traced the truck to Gary Ridgeway. Officers went to his house on April 1, 1987, and spoke to him. Ridgeway denied ever seeing Marie. The detectives had no physical evidence. They left. Marie's body was not found until 2003. The critical thing to understand is the timeline. Gary killed the vast majority of his victims before he ever met Judith. Between 1982 and 1984, he was in a frenzy, killing multiple women every month. By the time he met Judith in 1985, he had already murdered more than 40 women. After he married Judith in 1988, he killed only 3 more confirmed victims. Judith's presence in his life appeared to reduce his compulsions significantly. Psychologists who studied Ridgeway believe that having a stable domestic relationship satisfied some of his need for control, reducing but not erasing his urge to kill. Their daily routine was mundane. Gary woke every morning at 3:30 a.m. He made coffee, brewing enough for 2 cups, and left 1 cup on the counter for Judith. He packed 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch. He kissed Judith on the cheek while she was still half asleep. Then he drove to the Kenworth factory and worked his shift. He came home in the afternoon. They ate dinner together. They watched television. They went to bed early. Judith wrote him love notes and tucked $20 bills into his lunchbox. She told everyone, "I have the perfect husband. He makes me feel like a newlywed every day." When Judith moved into Gary's house, she noticed there was no carpet anywhere. The floors were bare plywood subflooring. She asked Gary about it. He told her the carpet had been destroyed by kids from a previous relationship. She accepted this. Years later, detectives told Judith the truth. Gary had almost certainly wrapped a victim's body in that carpet and disposed of it. Judith had been walking on those bare floors for 13 years. In 1987, before they married, police obtained a search warrant for Gary's home. Marie Malvar's boyfriend and father had identified his truck. Detectives searched the property and collected hair and saliva samples. They found nothing obvious. Judith became aware after they married. Gary explained it to her. He told her police suspected him because he occasionally picked up prostitutes for sex. He admitted this openly. He said he had a problem but had never hurt anyone. He reminded her he had passed a polygraph test in 1984. Police had searched and found nothing. Judith believed him. He had been honest about picking up prostitutes, which made her trust his denial about hurting anyone. What Judith did not know was that Gary had hidden condoms in the garage and in his pickup truck. He had used Judith's car to pick up victims. Police later found semen traces in her car. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgeway was arrested at the Kenworth factory as he left his shift. The break came from DNA technology. Hair and saliva samples from the 1987 search had been stored for 14 years. In 2001, forensic scientists retested them using modern DNA profiling. The DNA matched semen recovered from multiple victims' bodies. Gary Ridgeway was the Green River killer. Additionally, microscopic spray paint spheres on victims' clothing matched the paint used at Kenworth. 2 detectives arrived at Judith's home that afternoon. They told her Gary had been arrested for murders connected to the Green River killer investigation. Judith's first reaction was disbelief. She told them they were wrong. Gary had been cleared years ago. He had passed a polygraph. This was impossible. She visited Gary in jail. She pressed her hand against the glass partition. She told him she believed in him. Gary did not tell her the truth. Judith went home still believing in his innocence. Then she found condoms hidden in the garage. They were not the brand she and Gary used. She found more in his truck. She stood in the garage holding them and realization broke through. Gary had been with other women. She said later, "Then I felt the anger, that he had sex with someone else, that he hurt me, that he betrayed me." Over the following months, Gary confessed. He agreed to plead guilty to 48 murders to avoid the death penalty. Prosecutors later added one more, bringing the total to 49 confirmed victims, though Gary confessed to possibly 71. He led police to dump sites, helping them recover remains that had been there for 20 years. Judith learned that 4 victims had been killed during their marriage. She learned Gary had used her car to transport victims. She learned he had been lying every single day for 13 years. She said to a reporter, "Oh, I'd say, well, you son of a bitch, why did you do this to me?" On December 18, 2003, Gary Leon Ridgeway stood before Judge Richard Jones and pleaded guilty to 49 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Judge Jones sentenced him to 49 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 480 years. Judge Jones addressed him, "You have made it difficult for me to see you as a human being." The courtroom was filled with victims' families. Many gave impact statements. Some screamed at Ridgeway. Some wept, holding photographs of daughters who had never come home. Ridgeway sat stone-faced. When given the chance to speak, he offered a prepared apology. Nobody forgave him. Judith did not attend the sentencing. She cut off all contact. She refused his calls and letters. She changed her name so she would no longer be associated with Ridgeway. She dyed her hair. She changed her appearance because she did not want to look like the suburban housewife married to Gary Ridgeway. She spent the next 2 years in isolation, drinking heavily, taking pain pills. In 2007, she cooperated with author Penny Moorhead to write Green River Serial Killer, biography of an unsuspecting wife. She gave interviews to ABC News, People magazine, and the Daily Mail. Her most quoted line, "I had the perfect husband, but he was the perfect murderer." Gary Leon Ridgeway is now 77 years old, incarcerated at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, serving 49 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 480 years. He will die in prison. He has never shown genuine remorse. By 2021, Judith told the Kent Reporter, "I'm comfortable with my life now." Comfortable, but not healed. How do you heal from learning that the man who made you coffee every morning had strangled 49 women? Judith Morrison spent 13 years believing she knew Gary Ridgeway completely. She thought there were no secrets between them. She was wrong about everything. He had hidden 49 murders from her. He made her coffee with the same hands he used to strangle women. He kissed her goodbye and went to work, where he painted trucks with the same paint that would later be found on his victims' clothing. He lived 2 completely separate lives, and Judith only ever saw one of them until the day 2 detectives knocked on her door and told her the truth. And even then, she did not believe them at first. That was how complete the deception was. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. Judith Morrison helped police search her home in 1987 and still believed her husband was innocent. But the next wife couldn't ignore the smell of decomposition coming from beneath her feet, or the teenage boys her husband brought home in the middle of the night. Case 3. Carol Hoff. In the summer of 1975, Carol Hoff stood in the kitchen of her home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, Illinois, making dinner for her family. Her husband John was in the garage, as he often was, tinkering with something she could not see. Their house was a modest ranch-style home in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago. Carol had 2 daughters from her previous marriage, and John had been a good stepfather to them. He worked hard running his own construction business, PDM Contractors. He was active in the community, organising elaborate block parties and charity events. He dressed up as Patchwork the Clown and Pogo the Clown to entertain children at hospitals and fundraisers. Neighbours thought he was wonderful, but there was a smell in the house that Carol could not explain. It came from the crawl space beneath their feet. John told her it was moisture build-up, a broken sewer pipe, nothing to worry about. He said he would get it fixed when he had time. The smell got worse as the months went by. By early 1976, it was so strong that Carol could barely stand to be in certain rooms. What she did not know, what she could not have imagined, was that beneath the house where she cooked dinner and tucked her daughters into bed at night, 26 bodies were decomposing in the crawl space. Her husband was burying teenage boys under their home. John Wayne Gacy was born March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in an abusive household with an alcoholic father who beat him regularly. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964. They moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy managed several Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by Marlyn's father. In 1968, Gacy was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy, the son of a fellow JC's member. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Marlyn divorced him while he was incarcerated. Gacy served 18 months and was released on parole in June 1970. He moved back to Chicago and bought the house on West Summerdale Avenue. He started PDM Contractors, a construction company that hired teenage boys to do manual labor. He remarried in 1972. His new wife was Carol Hoff. Carol had known John since high school. They had been friends. She was divorced with 2 young daughters when she reconnected with John in 1971. He seemed to have turned his life around after his time in prison. He was running a successful business. He was charming, generous, funny. He took Carol and her daughters to dinner, bought them gifts, made them laugh. He told Carol about his conviction in Iowa, explaining it as a misunderstanding, a moment of poor judgment that he deeply regretted. He said he had paid his debt to society and wanted a fresh start. Carol believed him. She saw a man who had made a mistake and learned from it. They married on July 1st, 1972, in a small ceremony. Carol and her daughters moved into the house on West Summerdale Avenue. For the first year, things seemed normal, but John Wayne Gacy had not stopped. He had not learned. He had not changed. On January 3rd, 1972, 6 months before he married Carol, Gacy murdered Timothy Jack McCoy, a 16-year-old boy he picked up at the Greyhound bus station in Chicago. Gacy brought Timothy back to his house, had sex with him, then stabbed him to death. He buried the body in the crawl space beneath the house. This was Gacy's first confirmed murder, though he later claimed there may have been others before Timothy. After marrying Carol, Gacy killed again, and again, and again. His method was consistent. He hired teenage boys to work for PDM Contractors. He picked up young men at bus stations, in bars, on street corners. He lured them to his house with promises of work, money, or drugs. Once inside, he would offer them alcohol or marijuana. When they were intoxicated or distracted, he would overpower them. He had a trick he called the handcuff trick, where he would demonstrate how to escape from handcuffs, then snap the cuffs on his victims' wrists and tell them there was no escape. Once they were restrained, he would rape them. Then he would strangle them, usually with a rope or a board twisted with a tourniquet. After they were dead, he would drag their bodies to the crawl space and bury them in shallow graves in the dirt. When the crawl space started to fill up, he began dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. Carol noticed changes in John as their marriage progressed. Their sex life stopped almost completely within the first year. John showed no interest in being intimate with her. When she asked him about it, he became defensive, angry. He told her she was not attractive to him anymore. He blamed her. But the truth was that John's sexual interests lay elsewhere. Carol started finding things in the house that disturbed her. She found gay pornography magazines hidden in the garage. When she confronted John about them, he exploded with rage. He told her it was none of her business. He told her to stay out of his things. She found wallets that did not belong to John or to anyone she knew. Wallets of teenage boys. Driver's licenses with young faces staring back at her. When she asked John about them, he said they belonged to employees who had left them behind. She wanted to believe him. The smell in the house became unbearable. It was a sickly, sweet odour, the smell of decay and rot. John told Carol it was a moisture problem in the crawl space, that the ground beneath the house was not draining properly. He said he had poured lime down there to help with the smell. He said he would call a plumber when he had time, but he never did. The smell persisted. Carol opened windows even in the middle of winter. She burned incense. She sprayed air freshener. Nothing helped. Neighbours started commenting on the smell. John told them the same story about the sewer pipe and the moisture. Most people believed him. What else could it be? Carol's daughters began to feel uncomfortable around John. He was short-tempered with them, unpredictable. He would be kind one moment and cruel the next. Carol herself was becoming afraid of him. When she questioned him about anything, his anger was immediate and frightening. He never hit her, but the threat of violence was always present in the way he raised his voice, the way he slammed doors, the way he looked at her when she pushed too hard. By early 1976, Carol had reached her breaking point. The smell, the pornography, the wallets, the lack of intimacy, the rage. She told John she wanted a divorce. He did not fight her on it. On March 2nd, 1976, their divorce was finalised. Carol took her daughters and moved out of the house on West Summerdale Avenue. She never wanted to see John Wayne Gacy again. After Carol left, Gacy's killing accelerated dramatically. Without a wife in the house, without the need to maintain any appearance of normalcy, he spiralled. Between 1976 and 1978, he murdered at least 30 more young men and boys. The crawl space filled with bodies. He ran out of room and started stacking them on top of each other, wrapping them in cloth or plastic. When the crawl space could hold no more, he began dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River, driving across bridges late at night and throwing the bodies into the water. On December 11th, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peast disappeared after telling his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a summer job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Robert's mother reported him missing immediately. Police investigated and quickly focused on Gacy. They obtained a search warrant for his house. On December 21st, 1978, investigators entered the home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. They immediately noticed the smell. One investigator went into the crawl space and found a body within minutes. Then another. Then another. Over the next several days, police excavated the crawl space and found 26 bodies buried beneath the house. They found 3 more bodies buried in the yard. Eventually, 4 bodies were recovered from the Des Plaines River, bringing the total to 33 confirmed victims. John Wayne Gacy was arrested and charged with 33 counts of murder. Carol Hoff learned about the discoveries from news reports. She saw the aerial footage of police digging up the yard of the house where she had lived for 4 years. She saw the body bags being carried out. She realised she had been sleeping, eating, raising her children directly above a mass grave. The house where she had cooked dinner, where her daughters had played, where she had tried to build a normal life with a man she thought she knew, had been a burial ground the entire time. During Gacy's trial in 1980, Carol was called to testify. She sat on the witness stand and answered questions about their marriage, about the smell in the house, about the wallets she had found, about the pornography, about John's behaviour. The defence tried to portray her as someone who must have known, who must have suspected, but Carol maintained that while she knew something was wrong, she never imagined the truth. How could she? Who would imagine their husband was burying murdered boys beneath their home? The prosecution used her testimony to establish a timeline of Gacy's activities during their marriage. On March 13, 1980, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 counts of murder. Judge Louis Garippo sentenced him to death. Gacy was sent to Menard Correctional Center to await execution. He spent 14 years on death row, filing appeals, giving interviews, painting pictures of clowns that he sold to collectors. He never showed genuine remorse. He claimed he was innocent, that the bodies had been planted, that employees of PDM contractors were responsible. Nobody believed him. On May 10, 1994, at 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. He was 52 years old. His last words were, "Kiss my ass." Outside the prison, crowds gathered. Some held signs celebrating his death. Some were families of victims who had waited 16 years for this moment. When news of the execution was announced, people cheered. Carol Hoff has lived the rest of her life in obscurity. She changed her name. She moved away from Chicago. She has never given extensive interviews about her time married to John Wayne Gacy. In the few brief statements she has made over the years, she has said that she had no idea what he was doing. She has said that she suspected he was gay, that she found the pornography disturbing, that the smell bothered her, but that she never imagined he was a murderer. She has said that discovering the truth destroyed her sense of reality, that she questioned every memory of their marriage, that she wondered how she could have been so blind. The house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue was demolished in April 1979. The lot remained empty for years because nobody wanted to build on land where 26 bodies had been buried. Eventually, a new house was built on the site, but the address was changed. The new owners wanted no association with what had happened there. Carol Hoff spent 4 years married to a man who murdered at least 33 young men and boys, many of them while she was living in the house. She slept above their graves. She walked above them every day. She cooked meals in a kitchen where the smell of their decomposition seeped up through the floorboards. She raised her daughters in a house that was a tomb, and she never knew until police started digging. John Wayne Gacy had created a house of horrors and convinced his wife it was a home. When the mask came off, when the bodies were carried out one by one, Carol had to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the monster he actually was. That reconciliation is impossible. Some betrayals are too complete. Some truths destroy everything that came before. Carol Hoff couldn't ignore the smell of decomposition coming from beneath her feet. But the next woman never smelled anything strange because her grandson was meticulous about cleaning up after the bodies he brought to her house. Case 4. Catherine Dahmer. In the autumn of 1981, Catherine Dahmer sat in the living room of her home at 2357 South 57th Street in West Allis, Wisconsin, knitting a blanket and watching the evening news. She was 75 years old, a widow living alone in a modest 2-story house she had owned for decades. Her husband had passed away years earlier. Her children had their own lives. The house was too big for one person, too quiet. When her grandson Jeffrey called and asked if he could move in with her for a while, Catherine said yes without hesitation. Jeffrey was 21 years old. He had been living with his father and stepmother in Ohio, but that arrangement had not worked out. He had dropped out of Ohio State University after 1 semester. He had served briefly in the army, but received an early discharge due to alcohol problems. He needed stability. He needed family. Catherine loved her grandson. She told him he could stay as long as he needed. On December 1st, 1981, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into his grandmother's house. He would live there for nearly 7 years. During that time, he would kill 4 young men in her home, dismember their bodies in her basement, and dispose of the remains in her trash. Catherine never knew. She thought she was helping her troubled grandson get back on his feet. She had no idea she was providing him with a private hunting ground. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His parents, Lionel and Joyce, had a troubled marriage filled with arguments and dysfunction. Jeffrey was a lonely child who became obsessed with dead animals as a young boy. He would find roadkill and take it into the woods behind his house, where he would dissect the animals and bleach their bones. His father, a chemist, thought this was normal scientific curiosity. It was not. In June 1978, shortly after graduating from high school, Jeffrey committed his first murder. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, 18 years old, and brought him back to his parents' house while they were away. When Stephen tried to leave, Jeffrey bludgeoned him with a barbell, strangled him, then dismembered the body and buried it in the backyard. Jeffrey was 18 years old. He would not kill again for 9 years. But when he started killing again in 1987, he could not stop. Catherine Dahmer was a devout woman who attended church regularly. She kept a clean house, cooked traditional meals, maintained routines. She was kind to her neighbours, tended her garden, volunteered at her church. When Jeffrey moved in, she gave him the bedroom on the 2nd floor. She told him he could stay rent-free as long as he helped around the house and looked for work. Jeffrey got a job at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center, drawing blood from donors. He worked there for several years. Catherine thought this was a good sign. Her grandson was working, contributing, staying out of trouble. She did not know that Jeffrey was drinking heavily, sometimes stealing blood from the plasma center to experiment with at home, and spending his evenings at gay bars in Milwaukee. For the first several years Jeffrey lived with Catherine, he did not kill. He worked. He drank. He struggled with his sexuality and his urges, but he controlled them. Catherine noticed Jeffrey drank too much. She found empty bottles hidden in his room. She talked to him about it, expressing concern, but Jeffrey assured her he had it under control. She believed him. She also noticed that Jeffrey sometimes brought young men home late at night. She would hear voices, footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the door to Jeffrey's room closing. This concerned her. She was from a different generation, a different time. She did not understand her grandson's sexuality, but she did not judge him for it. She simply asked him to be more discreet, to not bring strangers into her home late at night. Jeffrey apologized. He said it would not happen again. It happened again. On September 8, 1986, while living at Catherine's house, Jeffrey was arrested for masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys near the Kinnickinnick River. He was charged with lewd and lascivious behavior. Catherine was horrified when she found out. Her grandson had been arrested for exposing himself to children. Jeffrey told her it was a misunderstanding, that he had been drunk and urinating in public, that the charges were exaggerated. Catherine wanted to believe him. He was her grandson. She loved him. The case went to court. Jeffrey pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct. He was sentenced to 1 year probation and ordered to undergo counselling. Catherine told herself this was a wake-up call for Jeffrey, that he would get help, that things would improve. They did not. On September 15, 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer killed for the second time. He met Stephen Tuomi, 25 years old, at a gay bar in Milwaukee. They went to the Ambassador Hotel and rented a room. Jeffrey later claimed he did not remember killing Stephen, that he woke up in the hotel room to find Stephen dead. He said he must have strangled him during a blackout. Whether this was true or a convenient lie, Stephen Tuomi was dead. Jeffrey could not leave the body in the hotel. He went to a store and bought a large suitcase. He put Stephen's body inside the suitcase and took a taxi back to his grandmother's house. Catherine was not home. Jeffrey brought the suitcase down to the basement. He dismembered Stephen's body, pulverized the bones with a sledgehammer, and placed the remains in plastic bags in his grandmother's trash. The garbage collectors took the bags away with the regular trash. Stephen Tuomi disappeared. Nobody connected him to Jeffrey Dahmer. Nobody suspected anything. 2 months later, on November 20th, 1987, Jeffrey killed again. He met James Dockstater, 14 years old, outside a gay bar. Jeffrey offered him money to come back to his house and pose for photographs. James agreed. Jeffrey brought him to Catherine's house. They went down to the basement. Jeffrey gave James alcohol mixed with sleeping pills. When James was unconscious, Jeffrey strangled him. He dismembered the body in the basement, disposed of the remains in the trash, and bleached the basement floor. Catherine was upstairs the entire time. She heard nothing unusual. She had no idea her grandson had just murdered a 14-year-old boy in her basement. On March 24, 1988, Jeffrey killed Richard Guerrero, 25 years old, in the same manner. He lured him to Catherine's house, drugged him, strangled him in the basement, dismembered the body, disposed of the remains. Catherine was beginning to notice things that disturbed her. There was a smell in the basement. When she asked Jeffrey about it, he told her it was a dead animal, possibly a raccoon that had crawled under the house and died. He said he would take care of it. The smell persisted. Catherine also noticed stains in the basement. Jeffrey told her he had been doing taxidermy as a hobby, preserving animal remains. He showed her some bones he claimed were from animals. Catherine found this odd but plausible. Jeffrey had been interested in dead animals since childhood. Maybe this was just an extension of that interest. In September 1988, Catherine had had enough. It was not the smell or the stains specifically, it was everything. Jeffrey's drinking had not improved. He was still bringing strangers home late at night. He had been arrested again in September 1988 for drugging and sexually assaulting Somsak Synthasomphone, a 13-year-old Laotese boy. Jeffrey had lured Somsak to Catherine's house, given him a drink laced with drugs, and molested him in the basement. Somsak escaped and told his parents, who called police. Jeffrey was arrested and charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticement of a child for immoral purposes. This was Catherine's breaking point. She loved her grandson, but she could not have him living in her home anymore. She told him he needed to move out. Jeffrey understood. He did not argue with her. He found an apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. On September 25th, 1988, Jeffrey moved out of his grandmother's house. He had lived there for nearly 7 years. During that time, he had killed 4 young men in her basement. Catherine never knew. After moving into his own apartment, Jeffrey Dahmer's killing accelerated dramatically. Without his grandmother upstairs, without the need to be quiet or discreet, he spiraled completely out of control. Between September 1988 and July 1991, he murdered 13 more young men, bringing his total to 17 confirmed victims. He kept bodies in his apartment, preserved skulls, photographed corpses in explicit poses. On July 22, 1991, one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, escaped from Jeffrey's apartment and flagged down police. Officers went to the apartment and discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, a severed head in the refrigerator, and human remains throughout the apartment. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested. The entire world learned what he had been doing. Catherine Dahmer was 85 years old when her grandson was arrested. She was living in a nursing home by then. When the news broke, reporters tried to contact her for comment. Her family shielded her from the media. She released one brief statement through her son Lionel. "I had no knowledge of his activities. I loved my grandson very much." Catherine was interviewed by police. She told them about the smells in the basement, about Jeffrey's arrests while living with her, about asking him to leave. Investigators went to her house at 2357 South 57th Street and searched it thoroughly. They found no evidence of the murders that had taken place there years earlier. Jeffrey had been too careful, too thorough in cleaning up. The basement where 4 young men had been killed and dismembered yielded no physical evidence. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. He pleaded guilty, but insane, to 15 counts of murder. The jury rejected the insanity defense. On February 17, 1992, Jeffrey was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 957 years in prison. He was sent to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Catherine never visited him there. She was too old, too frail, too devastated by what she had learned. Catherine Dahmer died on Christmas Day, 1992. She was 88 years old. She died in the nursing home, surrounded by family. She had lived for 18 months after learning the truth about her grandson. 18 months of knowing that while she knitted blankets and cooked dinner upstairs, Jeffrey had been killing boys in her basement. 18 months of knowing that the smell she complained about had been human decomposition. 18 months of knowing that the young men she heard coming and going late at night had not all left alive. Those 18 months destroyed whatever peace she might have had at the end of her life. Jeffrey Dahmer did not attend his grandmother's funeral. He was in prison. On November 28, 1994, less than 2 years after Catherine's death, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver at Columbia Correctional Institution. Scarver used a metal bar from the prison weight room to bludgeon Jeffrey and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, while they were cleaning the prison gym bathroom. Jeffrey was 34 years old. He had been in prison for 2.5 years. Catherine Dahmer spent nearly 7 years living with her grandson while he killed 4 young men in her basement. She heard him bring them home. She smelled the decomposition. She saw the stains. She noticed his arrests, his drinking, his late-night visitors. She asked him to leave because something felt wrong, but she never imagined the truth. She died knowing that her home, the house where she had raised her family and lived for decades, had been Jeffrey Dahmer's killing ground. She died knowing that by offering her grandson a place to stay, by trying to help him, she had unwittingly provided him with the privacy he needed to murder. That knowledge haunted her final 18 months. There was no peace for Catherine Dahmer after the truth came out, only the terrible weight of what had happened beneath her roof while she slept upstairs, completely unaware. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. Catherine Dahmer never smelled anything strange because her grandson was meticulous about cleaning up. But the next daughter couldn't ignore the fact that victims were being buried in the garden where she played as a child. Case 5. Mae West. On a warm summer afternoon in 1987, 15-year-old Mae West sat in the garden at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, helping her mother Rosemary tend the vegetables. The garden was small but well maintained, with neat rows of plants and a freshly laid patio that Fred, her father, had installed a few weeks earlier. Mae's older sister Heather, 16, had been acting difficult lately, arguing with their parents, threatening to run away. Just that morning, Heather had stormed out of the house after another fight with Fred and Rosemary. Mae asked her mother where Heather had gone. Rosemary looked at her coldly and said something that would haunt Mae for the rest of her life. "She's under the patio, laughing at you." Mae thought it was a sick joke, the kind of dark humour her parents sometimes used. She did not understand that her mother was telling her the literal truth. Heather was under the patio. Heather had been murdered by their father just days earlier, dismembered and buried in the garden where May was now kneeling in the dirt. May West had been born into 25 Cromwell Street on June 1st, 1972. She had lived her entire childhood in a house where 8 victims were buried beneath her feet. She played in a garden that was a graveyard, and she never knew until police started digging 22 years later. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born September 29, 1941, in Muchmarcle, Herefordshire, England. He grew up in a poor rural family and left school barely literate. He married Rena Costello in 1962. They had 2 daughters, Charmaine and Anna Marie. The marriage was troubled. In 1968, Fred met Rosemary Letts. Rosemary was 15 years old. Fred was 27, married with 2 children. They began a relationship anyway. In 1970, Rosemary gave birth to Heather Ann West. Fred and Rena's marriage fell apart. Rena disappeared in 1971. Fred told people she had left and gone back to her family. The truth was that Fred had murdered her and buried her body in a field. On June 1st, 1972, Rosemary gave birth to May June West at 25 Cromwell Street, the house Fred had recently purchased. May was born into a house that was already becoming a tomb. Fred and Rosemary married in January 1972, shortly before May's birth. By all outward appearances, they were a normal working-class couple. Fred worked as a labourer. Rosemary stayed home with the children. But behind the doors of 25 Cromwell Street, something terrible was happening. Fred and Rosemary sexually abused their own children. They also lured young women to the house, where they raped, tortured, and murdered them. The first victim at Cromwell Street was Charmaine, Fred's stepdaughter. In the summer of 1971, 8-year-old Charmaine disappeared. Fred told neighbours she had gone to live with her mother. The truth was that Rosemary had murdered Charmaine, and Fred buried her body in the cellar beneath the house. Between 1973 and 1979, during May's early childhood, from ages 1 to 7, Fred and Rosemary murdered at least 8 more young women and buried them at 25 Cromwell Street. The victims included Linda Goff, 19, murdered in April 1973, Carol Ann Cooper, 15, murdered in November 1973, Lucy Partington, 21, a university student who disappeared after visiting a friend, Therese Siegenthaler, 21, murdered in April 1974, Shirley Hubbard, 15, murdered in November 1974, Juanita Mott, 18, murdered in April 1975, Shirley Robinson, 18, murdered in May 1978 while pregnant with Fred's child. Alison Chambers, 16, murdered in August 1979. All of these murders happened while May was a young child living in the house. She was playing in the garden where bodies were buried. She was sleeping in a bedroom above a cellar full of corpses. Fred and Rosemary continued having children. The house became crowded. Fred and Rosemary also took in lodgers, renting rooms to students and workers. The lodgers had no idea what was buried beneath the house. The children had no idea. Life in the West household appeared chaotic, but normal to outsiders. But inside the house, the children were being abused. Fred began sexually abusing May when she turned 13 years old. He abused his other daughters as well. The abuse was systematic and ongoing. Fred told May that this was normal, that all fathers did this. He told her not to tell anyone. May did not tell. She was terrified, ashamed, confused. Rosemary knew about the abuse. She participated in some of it. She also worked as a prostitute out of the house, seeing clients while the children were upstairs. In June 1987, May's older sister Heather, 16 years old, told friends she was planning to leave home. She was tired of the abuse, tired of the household. She had arguments with her parents. On June 19, 1987, Heather disappeared. Fred and Rosemary told the other children that Heather had run away. May believed this at first, but as weeks turned to months and Heather never contacted anyone, May started to wonder. When she asked her parents about Heather, Rosemary made that chilling statement about Heather being under the patio, laughing. Fred used Heather's disappearance as a threat to control his other children. He told May and her siblings, "You'll end up under the patio like Heather if you don't behave." The children thought it was just a threat. It was not. The truth was that Fred had murdered Heather in the bathroom of 25 Cromwell Street. He strangled her, dismembered her body in the bathtub, and buried her remains in the garden. He then built a patio over the burial site. May had helped her father build that patio, carrying bricks, mixing cement, having no idea what was underneath. May left home as soon as she could. She moved out in her late teens, trying to escape the abuse, trying to build a normal life. But she visited her parents. She brought her own children to visit their grandparents. Fred and Rosemary seemed like doting grandparents. In August 1992, a young woman reported that she had been raped at 25 Cromwell Street. Police investigated, but the case did not result in charges. Social services became involved. In the course of their investigation, social workers talked to the West children. The children made comments about Heather being buried under the patio. One detective, Hazel Savage, took the comments seriously. She suspected something was very wrong at 25 Cromwell Street. On February 24, 1994, police obtained a warrant to search the property. They were looking for Heather's remains. They began digging in the garden. Within hours, they found human bones, then more. The excavation expanded. By the time it was complete, they had recovered the remains of 9 victims from 25 Cromwell Street, plus Charmaine in the cellar. As the investigation continued, police found more victims at Fred's former residences. The total count reached 12 confirmed victims. Mae West learned all of this from the news. She saw aerial footage of her childhood home surrounded by police tape. She saw investigators in white suits carrying bones from the garden where she had played. She realised that every time her father had threatened, "You'll end up under the patio like Heather," he had been telling the truth. She realised her sister Heather, who she thought had run away, had been murdered and buried in the garden, and May had helped build the patio over her grave. On January 1st, 1995, Fred West hanged himself in his cell at Winson Green Prison. He used strips of bedsheet to make a noose. He was 53 years old. He died before he could stand trial. Rosemary West stood trial alone. The trial began on October 3rd, 1995 at Winchester Crown Court. Mae West testified at her mother's trial. She sat in the witness box and described the abuse she had suffered, the environment she had grown up in. It was the most difficult thing she had ever done. On November 22nd, 1995, the jury found Rosemary West guilty of 10 counts of murder. Judge Charles Mantell sentenced her to life in prison with a whole life order, meaning she would never be eligible for parole. She would die in prison. Rosemary showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She is currently incarcerated at HMP Low Newton in County Durham. The house at 25 Cromwell Street became a macabre tourist attraction. Gloucester City Council decided the house needed to be demolished. On October 11, 1996, demolition crews tore down 25 Cromwell Street. The rubble was crushed and buried in a secret location. A public walkway was built on the site. There is no marker, nothing to indicate what happened there. Mae West struggled for years after the trial. She had cosmetic surgery to change her appearance because people recognised her as Fred and Rosemary West's daughter. She changed her name. In 2018, she published a memoir titled Love As Always, Mum, XXX, the true and terrible story of surviving a childhood with Fred and Rose West. The title comes from the way Rosemary signed letters to May from prison. Even after everything, Rosemary continued writing to May, as if they had a normal mother-daughter relationship. May eventually stopped responding, but Rosemary kept writing. In her book, May describes what it was like growing up at 25 Cromwell Street. She writes about the abuse, about the fear, about the day police started digging up the garden. She writes about testifying against her mother, about the guilt she felt for not knowing, for not saving Heather, for surviving when so many others did not. Mae West spent the first 22 years of her life living in and visiting a house where 10 people were buried. She played in a garden that was a graveyard. She was abused by the same man who murdered those victims. She was threatened with ending up under the patio like Heather, without knowing Heather was actually there. When the truth came out, when police dug up the garden and the cellar, May had to reconstruct her entire childhood. Every memory was tainted. The garden where she played, the cellar where she did laundry, the bathroom where she bathed. All of it had been the site of unimaginable horror. And she had lived there, unaware, for years. That knowledge destroyed any possibility of normal memories. Mae West's childhood became something she had to survive twice. Once while living it, and again after learning what it really was. Mae West couldn't ignore the fact that victims were being buried in the garden where she played as a child, but the next residents had no idea that bodies were being dissolved in the bathtub 1 floor above them. Case 6. Residents of 23 Cranley Gardens. In early February 1983, the residents of 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London, began complaining about the drains. The building was a 3-storey Victorian house that had been converted into flats. Jim Alcock lived on the ground floor. Fiona Bridges lived on the middle floor. Dennis Nilsson, a 37-year-old civil servant who worked at the job centre in Kentish Town, lived alone in the top floor flat. The residents shared a common drainage system, and for several days the toilets had been backing up. The smell was unbearable. A thick, greasy sludge was preventing the drains from working properly. On February 8, 1983, the landlord called a plumber named Mike Catron to investigate. Catron arrived that evening and went down to inspect the manhole that led to the building's main drainage pipe. He opened the cover and looked inside. What he saw made him gag. The drain was clogged with a pale, fleshy substance that looked disturbingly organic. Catron reached in and pulled out a piece. It was soft, white, fatty tissue. It looked like meat. He showed it to Jim Alcock and told him it looked like human flesh. The next morning, Catron returned with his supervisor. They went back to the manhole. The flesh was gone. Someone had removed it during the night, but when they reached deeper into the pipe, they found more. Pieces of bone, chunks of tissue. There was no mistaking it. These were human remains. They called the police, and within hours, officers were climbing the stairs to the top floor flat where Dennis Nilsson lived. Dennis Andrew Nilsson was born November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Scotland. He had a difficult childhood, marked by his beloved grandfather's death when Dennis was 6 years old. He joined the army at 16, served for 11 years, then joined the Metropolitan Police briefly, before finding work as a civil servant. Colleagues at the job centre found him helpful and competent. He was also deeply lonely. He was gay at a time when homosexuality had only recently been decriminalised in England. He drank heavily. He spent most evenings alone in his flat or at gay pubs in central London. He struggled with profound isolation and an inability to form meaningful relationships. What his colleagues and neighbours did not know was that Dennis Nilsson had been murdering young men since 1978. By the time police knocked on his door in February 1983, he had killed at least 12 people, possibly 15. Nilsson's first murder occurred on December 30, 1978, when he was living at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood. He met a young man at a pub, brought him home and strangled him. He kept the body under the floorboards for 7 months before burning it in a bonfire in the garden. Over the next 3 years at Melrose Avenue, Nilsson killed at least 12 more young men. His method was consistent. He picked up vulnerable young men, runaways, homeless individuals, or gay men looking for companionship. He brought them to his flat, gave them alcohol, waited until they passed out, then strangled them. After death, he would bathe the bodies and keep them in his flat for weeks. He talked to them, watched television with them, slept beside them. When decomposition became unbearable, he dismembered the bodies and buried the parts in the garden or burned them in bonfires. Neighbours sometimes complained about the smell of the fires. Nilsson told them he was burning rubbish. In October 1981, Nilsson moved to the top floor flat at 23 Cranley Gardens. The new flat was smaller, there was no garden, there was no privacy to burn or bury bodies, but Nilsson's compulsion to kill did not stop. Between 1981 and 1983, he murdered at least 3 more young men at Cranley Gardens. Without a garden, he had to find new ways to dispose of the bodies. He dismembered them in the bathtub. He boiled the flesh off the bones in large cooking pots on his stove. The smell was horrific, a thick, sweet stench of cooking meat that permeated the building. When neighbours asked about the smell, Nilsson told them he had been making soup or had burned something while cooking. He flushed the boiled flesh down the toilet in small pieces. He stored bones and skulls in a wardrobe in his flat. He put some remains in bags in an unlocked shed behind the building. He was careless because he had gotten away with it for so long. The residents of 23 Cranley Gardens noticed things, but they did not know what they were noticing. The smell from Nilsson's flat was terrible, but people burned food, People forget to take out trash. The drains backing up was annoying, but old buildings have plumbing problems. When Fiona Bridges heard strange noises from the flat above hers late at night, sounds like something heavy being dragged across the floor, she assumed Nielsen was rearranging furniture. When Jim Alcock noticed an odd smell in the building's common areas, he thought maybe there was a dead rat in the walls. None of them suspected that a man was being murdered, dismembered, and boiled just above their heads. They lived ordinary lives, went to work, came home, watched television, slept in their beds, completely unaware that human remains were being flushed through the pipes beneath them. On the morning of February 9th, 1983, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and other officers arrived at 23 Cranley Gardens. They climbed the stairs to Dennis Nielsen's top-floor flat and knocked on the door. Nielsen answered. He was calm, polite, dressed for work in a suit and tie. The officers told him they were investigating a blockage in the drains and had found what appeared to be human remains. They asked if he knew anything about it. Nielsen looked at them for a moment, then said, "Good grief, how awful." The officers asked if they could search his flat. Nielsen agreed. As soon as they stepped inside, the smell hit them. It was overpowering, the stench of death and decay. Officers searched the flat. In the bathroom, they found remnants of flesh in the bathtub. In the wardrobe, they found plastic bags containing human bones. In the kitchen, they found a large cooking pot with a fatty residue coating the inside. On top of the wardrobe, they found 2 skulls. Detective Chief Inspector J asked, "Where's the rest of the body?" Nielsen responded calmly, "In 2 plastic bags in the wardrobe next door. I'll show you." Nielsen was arrested and confessed immediately. He seemed almost relieved. Over several interviews, he confessed to killing 15 or 16 young men, though he could not remember the exact number. He could not remember all of their names. Some he had never known. He described his methods in detail: the strangulation, the bathing of the bodies, the weeks or months he kept them, the dismemberment, the disposal. He spoke in a flat, matter-of-fact tone. Nielsen explained that he killed because he did not want to be alone. He said the men were going to leave him, so he made sure they could not. Keeping their bodies meant they stayed with him. Police identified some victims through dental records and missing persons reports. The confirmed victims from 23 Cranley Gardens were John Howlett, 23, murdered in December 1981, Graham Allen, 27, murdered in 1982, Stephen Sinclair, 20, murdered on January 26, 1983, just 2 weeks before Nielsen's arrest. Stephen Sinclair was a homeless drug addict. Nielsen had met him in a pub, brought him home, strangled him while he was unconscious, and then dismembered his body in the bathtub over the following days. While Nielsen was cutting up Stephen Sinclair's body, the other residents of 23 Cranley Gardens were going about their normal lives just below him. Dennis Nielsen's trial began on October 24, 1983, at the Old Bailey in London. He was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The attempted murder charges related to 2 men who had survived encounters with Nielsen. Carl Stotter had been strangled and drowned in Nielsen's bathtub, but survived when Nielsen pulled him out of the water and revived him. Stotter testified at the trial, describing the horrifying moment he realised Nielsen was trying to kill him. Nielsen's defence argued that he was insane, suffering from diminished responsibility. But the prosecution argued that Nielsen knew exactly what he was doing. He held down a job, he functioned in society, he planned his murders carefully, he disposed of evidence. On November 4, 1983, the jury found Dennis Nielsen guilty of 6 counts of murder. Judge Croom Johnson sentenced him to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. The judge told Nielsen, "There is no mitigation. I would hope that you will never be allowed to leave prison." Dennis Nielsen spent 34 years in prison. He showed little genuine remorse for his victims. In 2018, at the age of 72, Dennis Nielsen died of a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm at York Hospital. He had been in prison for 34 years and had never been released. The building at 23 Cranley Gardens still stands. After Nielsen's arrest, the flat was thoroughly cleaned, but the building's reputation was destroyed. For years, people avoided it. The flat where Nielsen had lived was eventually re-rented, but tenants never stayed long. Jim Alcock and Fiona Bridges moved away as soon as they could. They had lived just below a man who was boiling human flesh in his kitchen. They had shared a building with corpses stored in a wardrobe. They had used the same drains that Nilsson was using to flush away the remains of his victims, and they had never known. The smell, the sounds, the blocked drains, all of it had seemed like normal problems with an old building. It was only when Mike Catran pulled human flesh from the drain that the truth became undeniable. The residents of 23 Cranley Gardens spent years living in a building where murder was happening just above them. They smelled the odour of boiling flesh, but thought it was soup. They heard dragging sounds, but thought it was furniture. They dealt with blocked drains, but thought it was a plumbing issue. Every explanation seemed reasonable, because they could not imagine the truth. Dennis Nilsson seemed like a quiet, polite civil servant who kept to himself, and that ordinariness was exactly what allowed him to kill 12 or more young men without anyone suspecting. When the truth came out, when they learned that human remains had been passing through the building's drainage system, that bones had been stored just above their heads, that the smell they had been living with was death, their sense of safety in their own home was shattered completely. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. The residents at 23 Cranley Gardens had no idea that bodies were being boiled in the flat above them until the plumber found the evidence. But the next woman reported her boyfriend to police twice, and both times they dismissed her concerns, even though he matched the description of a killer terrorizing the Pacific Northwest. Case 7. Elizabeth Kleper. In the autumn of 1969, Elizabeth Kleper walked into the Sandpiper Tavern in Seattle, Washington, looking for a quiet drink after putting her 3-year-old daughter Molly to bed. Elizabeth was a 24-year-old divorced single mother working as a secretary at the University of Washington. She was lonely, exhausted from juggling work and parenting alone, and not particularly interested in meeting anyone that night. But across the bar, she noticed a handsome young man sitting by himself. He had dark hair, bright eyes, and a warm smile. He noticed her too. He walked over and introduced himself. His name was Ted Bundy. He was 22 years old, a student at the University of Washington studying Chinese. He seemed kind, articulate, charming in a shy sort of way. They talked for hours that night. Ted told her about his studies, his ambitions, his dreams of going to law school. He asked about her daughter. He did not seem put off by the fact that Elizabeth was a single mother. By the end of the night, Elizabeth felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something good. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the man sitting across from her would become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. And for the next 7 years, she would love him completely, while he murdered at least 30 young women who looked just like her. Theodore Robert Bundy was born November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. For the first years of his life, Ted was raised believing his grandparents were his parents, and his mother was his older sister. The family moved to Tacoma, Washington when Ted was young. His mother married Johnny Bundy, who adopted Ted and gave him his surname. Ted grew up feeling like an outsider, ashamed of his illegitimate birth. He was intelligent, charismatic, and deeply insecure. He studied psychology at the University of Washington, volunteered at a crisis hotline, and worked on political campaigns. Everyone who knew him thought he was destined for success. When Ted met Elizabeth in 1969, he had not yet killed anyone. For the first few years of their relationship, he was the man Elizabeth thought he was, a devoted boyfriend, a loving stepfather figure to Molly, a reliable presence in their lives. Ted spent nights at Elizabeth's apartment. He played with Molly, read her bedtime stories, made her breakfast. Elizabeth fell deeply in love with him. She thought about marriage. She imagined a future where Ted would officially become Molly's father, where they would be a family. Ted talked about that future too. He told Elizabeth he loved her. He told her she and Molly were the most important people in his life. But in 1974, everything changed. On January 4th, 1974, Ted broke into the basement apartment of 18-year-old Joni Lenz and beat her with a metal rod. She survived but suffered permanent brain damage. 11 days later, Linda Ann Healy, 21, was abducted from her basement apartment and vanished without a trace. Then Donna Gail Manson, 19, disappeared on March 12, 1974. Susan Rancourt, 18, vanished April 17th. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, disappeared May 6th. Brenda Carol Ball, 22, vanished June 1st. On July 14, 1974, two young women disappeared from Lake Sammamish State Park in broad daylight. Witnesses saw a handsome young man with his arm in a sling, asking women to help him load a sailboat onto his car. The man introduced himself as Ted. Janice Ott, 23, was seen leaving with him. Denise Nasland, 18, disappeared from the same park that afternoon. Their remains were found together months later. Police released a composite sketch. Elizabeth saw it in the newspaper. Her heart stopped. The man in the sketch looked like Ted. The name the suspect had used was Ted. Ted drove a Volkswagen Beetle, the same type of car witnesses had described. Elizabeth called the King County Police tip line. She told them her boyfriend's name was Ted Bundy, that he matched the description, that he drove a Volkswagen Beetle. The officer thanked her and told her they would look into it. They did not. Ted Bundy's name went into a file with thousands of other tips that went nowhere. Elizabeth tried to convince herself she was being paranoid. But things she had noticed started to pile up in her mind. Ted kept plaster of Paris in his room. He had crutches, though he was not injured. She found surgical gloves in his car. She found a meat cleaver under the seat. When she asked him about these things, Ted always had an explanation. Elizabeth wanted to believe him, but the disappearances continued. Elizabeth called the police again. She gave them more information. She told them about the items she had found. Again, nothing happened. Ted's name was already in the file. Police were focused on other suspects. Ted Bundy seemed like an unlikely killer. He was educated, well-spoken, involved in politics and community service. In the fall of 1974, Ted moved to Utah to attend law school. Elizabeth stayed in Seattle with Molly. They maintained a long-distance relationship. Elizabeth had no idea that Ted's move to Utah coincided with a new wave of disappearances and murders. Melissa Smith, 17, disappeared October 18, 1974, in Utah. Laura Aim, 17, vanished October 31st. Deborah Kent, 17, disappeared November 8th. Carol DeRonch, 18, was abducted on November 8th but escaped when she fought back and jumped from Ted's car. She went to police immediately. Police began connecting cases across state lines. On August 16, 1975, Ted Bundy was pulled over for a traffic violation in Utah. Officer Bob Hayward noticed suspicious items in Ted's Volkswagen: handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, pantyhose with eye holes cut out. Ted was arrested. Carol DeRonch identified him in a lineup. Ted was charged with aggravated kidnapping. Elizabeth could not believe it. Ted called her from jail. He told her it was a mistake. He begged her to believe him. Part of her still did. In February 1976, Ted was convicted of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. But investigators were building murder cases against him. In January 1977, Ted was charged with the murder of Karen Campbell, who had disappeared from a Colorado ski resort. Ted was extradited to Colorado to stand trial. On June 7, 1977, while acting as his own attorney, Ted jumped from a courthouse window during a recess and escaped. He was recaptured 8 days later. On December 30, 1977, Ted escaped again from his jail cell, crawling through a hole he had sawed in the ceiling. Ted fled to Florida. On January 15, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee. In 15 minutes, he attacked 4 women. Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20, were beaten to death. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler were severely injured but survived. Less than an hour later, Ted attacked Cheryl Thomas in her apartment 8 blocks away. She survived with permanent injuries. On February 9, 1978, Ted abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. She was his final victim. Ted was arrested on February 15, 1978 in Pensacola, Florida. Elizabeth followed all of this from Seattle. She watched the news coverage, tried to reconcile the man she loved with the monster being described in court. She still visited him. She still took his calls. She still wanted to believe there was some explanation. Ted's trial for the Chi Omega murders began in June 1979. The evidence was overwhelming. Bite marks on Lisa Levy's body matched Ted's teeth. Eyewitnesses placed him at the scene. Fibers from the Chi Omega house were found in his car. On July 24, 1979, Ted Bundy was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Edward Cowart sentenced him to death. Ted was also tried and convicted for the murder of Kimberly Leach. He received a second death sentence. From death row, Ted called Elizabeth late one night around 2 a.m. Elizabeth answered, groggy and confused. Ted's voice was different, quieter, almost vulnerable. He told her there were things he had done that she did not know about. He said he had tried to kill her once. Elizabeth's blood went cold. Ted told her that one night when she was sleeping, he had closed the damper on her fireplace and turned on the gas, trying to fill the apartment with smoke and kill her. She had woken up coughing and opened a window, saving herself without realizing what he had done. Ted told her this as if confessing a minor transgression. Elizabeth hung up the phone. She felt nauseous, terrified, betrayed in a way she had never imagined possible. Elizabeth eventually wrote a book about her relationship with Ted. It was published in 1981 under the pseudonym Elizabeth Kendall, with the title The Phantom Prince: My Life with Ted Bundy. In it, she described their relationship, the warning signs she missed, the denial she lived in, the painful process of accepting the truth. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. He was 42 years old. In the days before his execution, he confessed to 30 murders, though investigators believe the actual number may be higher. He wrote a final letter to Elizabeth, professing his love for her, asking for her forgiveness. Her daughter Molly, now an adult, intercepted it. She read it, then burned it. She did not want her mother to read Ted's words one more time. In 2020, a documentary titled Falling for a Killer featured Elizabeth and Molly speaking publicly about their experiences for the first time. Elizabeth was in her 70s, Molly was in her 50s. They described what it was like to love Ted Bundy, to live with him, to trust him completely while he was killing women who looked like Elizabeth. Molly described being a child in Ted's presence, feeling loved and protected by a man who was capable of unimaginable violence. Elizabeth Kleper spent 7 years in a relationship with Ted Bundy. He was in her home constantly. He played with her daughter. He slept in her bed. He told her he loved her. And during much of that time, he was murdering young women. He kept his two lives completely separated. The man who read bedtime stories to Molly was the same man who beat Margaret Bowman to death with a piece of firewood. The man who helped Elizabeth fix her broken washing machine was the same man who strangled Linda Ann Healy and dumped her body in the woods. Elizabeth reported him to police twice before his arrest, and both times her tips were dismissed. She lived with the guilt of wondering if she could have stopped him, if she should have seen the truth sooner, if more women would be alive if she had been more suspicious, less trusting, less in love. That guilt was irrational, but it was real. Ted Bundy was a predator who wore a mask of normalcy so convincing that even the woman who loved him most could not see through it until it was far too late. Elizabeth Kleper reported Ted Bundy to police twice and was dismissed both times, but the next wife never reported her husband because she never suspected anything was wrong, even though he was killing dozens of women while living a perfectly normal domestic life in the Soviet Union. Case 8. Fyina Chicatilo. In the spring of 1990, Fyina Chicatilo sat in the small apartment she shared with her husband Andrei in Rostov-on-Don, Russia, preparing dinner for their family. It was a Thursday evening. Andrei would be home soon from his job as a supply clerk at a local factory. Their daughter Ludmila was married and living in her own home. Their son Yuri still lived with them, working at a local plant. The apartment was modest but comfortable, filled with the ordinary sounds of Soviet domestic life. The radio playing softly, water boiling on the stove, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Fyina had been married to Andrei for 27 years. They had married young in 1963, when Fyina was barely out of her teens. Their marriage had not been passionate. Andrei was impotent from their very first night together, a fact that had caused him deep shame and frustration for decades. But they had managed to have 2 children through persistence and patience, and over the years, Fyina had made peace with the lack of physical intimacy. Andrei was a good provider. He did not drink heavily like so many Soviet men. He did not beat her. He came home every night. He was quiet, withdrawn, sometimes sullen, but never violent toward her or the children. Fyina considered herself fortunate. Many women she knew had far worse husbands. What Fyina did not know, what she could not have imagined, was that the quiet man who sat across from her at dinner every night had spent the last 12 years murdering children and young women across the Rostov region. By the time police finally arrested him in November 1990, Andrei Chikatilo had killed at least 52 people, possibly more, and Fyina had never suspected a thing. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born October 16, 1936, in a village of Yablochnaya in Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. He grew up during the catastrophic famine of the 1930s and the brutality of World War II. His childhood was marked by poverty, violence and trauma. He was a weak, sickly child who wet the bed into his teenage years, which brought him constant humiliation and beatings from his mother. He was severely nearsighted, but too poor to afford glasses. He struggled in school socially and was bullied relentlessly. By the time he reached adulthood, Andrei was deeply psychologically damaged, sexually dysfunctional, and filled with rage he could barely contain. He served in the Soviet army, then worked various jobs. In 1963, he married Fyina. She was young, plain, practical. She worked as a clerk. Andrei told her about his impotence before they married. Fyina accepted it. She wanted stability, a family, a home. Andrei could provide those things. Their wedding night was awkward and humiliating for Andrei. He could not perform. Fyina tried to be understanding, but Andrei felt like a failure. Over the months and years that followed, they found ways to conceive children despite his dysfunction. They had a daughter, Ludmila, and later a son, Yuri. Andrei worked as a teacher for several years, but was fired after allegations of inappropriate behaviour with students. He then found work as a supply clerk for a factory in Rostov-on-Don. The job required him to travel frequently throughout the region, procuring materials and delivering supplies to various locations. He was often away from home for days at a time. Fyina did not mind. She managed the household, raised the children, maintained their small apartment. When Andrei was home, he was quiet and distant. When he was away, Fyina assumed he was working. She never questioned where he went or what he did. That trust was the perfect cover. On December 22, 1978, Andrei Chikatilo committed his first known murder. He lured a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakotnova into an old shed near the Grushevka River in Shakhty. He attempted to rape her, but his impotence made penetration impossible. Frustrated and enraged, he stabbed her to death. He mutilated her body with his knife, finding that the violence gave him the sexual gratification he could never achieve through normal intercourse. He left her body in the shed and went home to Fyina. She noticed nothing unusual about him when he returned. He seemed tired from work, but that was normal. Police found Yelena's body 2 days later. The investigation focused on a local man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a previous conviction for child molestation. Kravchenko lived near where the body was found. Police arrested him. During interrogation, Kravchenko eventually confessed, though he later recanted, claiming the confession had been coerced. Andrei Chikatilo was never seriously considered a suspect. Fyina provided him with an alibi, telling police her husband had been home with her that evening. She believed this was true. She had no reason to think otherwise. Alexander Kravchenko was convicted of Yelena Zakotnova's murder and executed by firing squad on July 13, 1983. He had been innocent. Andrei Chikatilo had murdered Yelena, and an innocent man had died for his crime. Chikatilo felt emboldened. He had killed and escaped justice. He could do it again. Between 1978 and 1990, Andrei Chikatilo murdered at least 52 people, possibly as many as 56. Most of his victims were children and young women. He lured them with promises of food, money, or help. He took them to secluded areas near forests or railway stations. He strangled them, stabbed them, mutilated their bodies in horrific ways. He removed their eyes, believing there was a superstition that the eyes of the dead retain the image of the killer. He ate parts of some victims. The violence and mutilation were necessary for him to achieve sexual gratification. He could not function sexually in a normal way, so murder became his only outlet. After each killing, he returned home to Fyina. He washed his clothes. He ate dinner. He slept in their bed. Fyina noticed nothing. Andrei's job as a supply clerk gave him the perfect cover. He travelled constantly throughout the Rostov region. His absences were expected, documented, legitimate. He could be away from home for days without raising suspicion. During these trips, he hunted. He stalked train stations and bus stops, looking for vulnerable victims, runaways, prostitutes, mentally disabled individuals, children walking alone. He became adept at identifying people who would not be missed immediately, people whose disappearances would not trigger massive investigations. Between 1982 and 1985, the murders accelerated. Bodies were found in forests near Rostov, Shakhty, and other towns. The Soviet press did not report on serial killers. The official narrative was that such crimes were products of capitalist decadence and did not occur in the Soviet Union, but police knew something was happening. They called the unknown killer the Forest Strip Killer because so many bodies were found near wooded areas along railway lines. In September 1984, police arrested Andrei Chikatilo at a bus station in Rostov. He had been acting suspiciously, approaching young women and children. Officers found a knife, a length of rope, and a jar of Vaseline in his bag. They brought him in for questioning. He had scratches on his face. He seemed nervous, but when police tested his blood type, it did not match semen found at several crime scenes. The semen indicated type AB blood. Chikatilo's blood type was A. Police had to release him. What they did not know at the time was that Chikatilo was a rare individual whose blood type and semen type were different, a condition called a non-secretor. The blood test had saved him. He went home to Fyina. She knew he had been questioned by police. Andrei told her it was a misunderstanding, that police were harassing people randomly in their desperation to solve the murders. Fyina believed him. Her husband was a quiet supply clerk. He was not a killer. The murders continued. More bodies were found. The investigation grew larger. In 1985, a special investigator named Viktor Burakov was assigned to the case full-time. Burakov dedicated years to tracking the killer, developing a profile, mapping the murders. He became obsessed with finding the Forest Strip Killer. By 1990, police had a suspect list. They began conducting surveillance on individuals who fit the profile. Andrei Chikatilo was on that list because of the 1984 incident, but he was not a top priority. On November 6, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo murdered his final victim, 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik. He killed her in a forest near Donleskos station. On November 20, 1990, plainclothes officers saw Chikatilo emerging from a wooded area near Donleskos, with dirt on his clothes and a red smear on his face. They approached him, checked his identification, and let him go, but they made a note of the encounter. Days later, investigators connected him to the recent murder. On November 20, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was arrested at his workplace. Police took him into custody and began interrogation. Over the following days, Chikatilo confessed to 56 murders, providing details that only the killer could know. He led police to burial sites. He described his methods. He seemed relieved to finally confess. Fyina Chikatilo was at home when police came to tell her that her husband had been arrested for multiple murders. She did not believe them at first. There had to be a mistake. Andrei was a quiet man, a supply clerk, a father. He had been with her for 27 years. She knew him. When police told her the details, when they told her about the 56 victims, when they told her about the children he had murdered and mutilated, Fyina collapsed. She told investigators, "I could never imagine him being able to hurt one person, let alone 53. The number 53 was what she had been told at the time, though the final confirmed count would be 52. Andrei Chikatilo's trial began in April 1992 and lasted until October. He was held in an iron cage in the courtroom because authorities feared families of victims might attack him. Journalists from around the world attended. The Soviet Union had collapsed by then, and the new Russian government allowed unprecedented media coverage. Chikatilo's behaviour in court was erratic. He ranted, sang, exposed himself, claimed he was insane. The judge ordered him to be quiet repeatedly. Victims' families screamed at him from the gallery. Fyina attended some of the trial sessions. She sat in the back, silent, trying to understand how the man she had been married to for 29 years could have done these things. On October 15, 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders. Judge Leonid Akubzanov sentenced him to death for each count. On February 14, 1994, Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in a soundproof room at a prison in Novocherkassk. He was 57 years old. Russian authorities did not inform his family of the execution until after it had been carried out. Fyina Chicatilo lived the rest of her life in obscurity. She changed her name. She moved away from Rostov-on-Don. She rarely spoke about Andrei. Their son Yuri changed his surname to his mother's maiden name, Chikatilo being too infamous to bear. Their daughter Ludmila also distanced herself from the family name. Fyina told a reporter years later that she never suspected Andrei was capable of violence. She said he had been a quiet, withdrawn man, sometimes irritable, but never aggressive toward her or the children. She said the impotence had created distance between them, but she had thought that was the extent of their marital problems. She had no idea it was driving him to murder. Fyina Chikatilo spent 27 years married to a man who murdered at least 52 people, many of them children. She provided him with an alibi that helped him escape justice for his first murder, though she did not know she was lying to police. She watched him come home from his travels, never questioning where he had been or what he had done. She noticed nothing suspicious, nothing alarming, nothing that suggested her husband was one of the most prolific serial killers in history. When the truth came out, when police told her what Andrei had done, Fyina's entire understanding of her life disintegrated. Every memory of their marriage was tainted. Every trip he took, every late night, every moment of distance between them, all of it took on a new and horrifying meaning. An innocent man had been executed for Andrei's first murder because Fyina told police her husband had been home. That knowledge alone was enough to destroy whatever peace she might have found. Fyina lived out her final years knowing that her husband had been a monster, and she had never seen it. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. Fyina Chikatilo never suspected her husband was wrong, even though he was killing dozens of women while living a perfectly normal domestic life in the Soviet Union. But the next wife's suspicions were raised when her doctor husband's patients kept dying at rates far higher than any other physicians in Britain. Case 9. Primrose Shipman. On the morning of June 24, 1998, Primrose Shipman sat at the reception desk of the Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde, Greater Manchester, England, answering phones and scheduling appointments. It was a Wednesday. The surgery was busy, as it always was when her husband Harold was working. Primrose had been working as a receptionist at Harold's practice for years, helping him manage patient records, book appointments, and maintain the smooth operation of the clinic. Harold was one of the most respected general practitioners in Hyde. Patients loved him. They requested him specifically. Elderly women especially trusted him completely, calling him to their homes at all hours. Primrose was proud of her husband. He had built a successful practice. He worked long hours, making house calls even late in the evening, always willing to help. That afternoon, Harold left the surgery to make a house call to Kathleen Grundy, an 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde who was active, healthy, and well-liked in the community. Kathleen had called saying she did not feel well. Harold went to her home on Joel Lane. Less than 2 hours later, Kathleen Grundy was dead. Harold signed the death certificate, attributing her death to old age. It seemed unremarkable. Kathleen was 81. People that age died. But what Primrose did not know, what she could never have imagined, was that her husband had just murdered Kathleen Grundy with a lethal injection of diamorphine. And Kathleen was not the first. She was not even close. Harold Shipman had been murdering his patients for 23 years. By the time police finally arrested him in September 1998, he had killed at least 215 people, possibly as many as 250. He was Britain's most prolific serial killer, and Primrose had been working at his side the entire time. Harold Frederick Shipman was born January 14, 1946 in Nottingham, England. He attended Leeds School of Medicine and graduated in 1970. On November 5, 1966, while still a medical student, Harold married Primrose May Oxtoby. Primrose was 17 years old. Harold was 20. She came from a working-class background, the daughter of a farm labourer. She was not educated beyond secondary school, but she was practical, hard-working, and devoted to Harold. They had 4 children together. Primrose supported Harold through medical school, working to help pay the bills, raising their children, managing the household. When Harold qualified as a doctor and began working as a general practitioner, Primrose was enormously proud. Harold's first position was at a medical centre in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, in 1974. But in 1975, Harold became addicted to pethidine, a powerful painkiller. He was forging prescriptions to feed his addiction. When the practice discovered this, Harold was fired and convicted of forgery. He was fined and ordered to attend a drug rehabilitation clinic. It was a humiliating scandal. Primrose stood by him. After completing rehabilitation, Harold was allowed to continue practicing medicine. In 1977, he took a position as a general practitioner in Hyde, Greater Manchester, joining the Donnybrook Medical Centre. Over the years, he built a large patient list. People in Hyde loved Dr. Shipman. He was attentive, made house calls, spent time with elderly patients, seemed genuinely to care. What nobody knew was that Harold Shipman had begun killing his patients. Between 1975 and 1998, Shipman murdered at least 215 patients, possibly as many as 250. The vast majority were elderly women. His method was consistent and almost impossible to detect. During house calls or after appointments at the surgery, Shipman would inject patients with lethal doses of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin. The patients would lose consciousness within minutes and die shortly after. Shipman would then record false information in their medical records, inventing symptoms of heart disease or other conditions that would make sudden death seem natural. He signed the death certificates himself, attributing deaths to old age, heart failure, or stroke. Because he was a trusted doctor and most victims were elderly, nobody questioned the deaths. Families were sad but not suspicious. Old people died. That was expected. Primrose worked at the surgery. She saw the patients coming and going. She scheduled Harold's house calls. She filed the death certificates. She saw the names of patients who had died, saw Harold writing in their files, heard him on the phone with grieving families offering condolences. She never suspected anything. Harold was her husband. He was a doctor. He was saving lives, not taking them. The sheer scale of what Harold was doing made it almost invisible. When a general practitioner has hundreds of elderly patients, deaths are routine. Harold made sure the victims fit a pattern that seemed natural. Elderly, often living alone, frequently with minor health complaints. Their deaths appeared unremarkable. But Harold Shipman made a mistake. On June 24, 1998, he murdered Kathleen Grundy. Kathleen was 81 years old, but she was healthy, active, and sharp-minded. She had been the mayoress of Hyde. She was involved in community organisations. Her sudden death was surprising to people who knew her, but what really raised suspicions was what happened after her death. Kathleen's will was read. It had been recently changed. The new will left her entire estate, valued at £386,000, to Harold Shipman. Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a solicitor. She was immediately suspicious. The will was typed on a basic typewriter with spelling errors and awkward phrasing. It did not sound like something her mother would have written. Angela knew her mother would never have left everything to her doctor and nothing to her family. Angela went to the police. On August 1st, 1998, Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles began investigating. Police interviewed Harold Shipman. He claimed Kathleen had asked him to witness the will. But a forensic document examiner determined that the will had been typed on a typewriter found in Harold Shipman's home. The signatures had been forged. Police realised that Shipman had murdered Kathleen Grundy and then forged a will to inherit her money. On September 7, 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested at his home. Primrose was there when police came. She watched them take Harold away in handcuffs. She could not believe it. There had to be a mistake. Harold was a doctor. He saved lives. Police exhumed Kathleen Grundy's body. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in her system. Police began investigating other deaths. They exhumed more bodies. Again and again, they found diamorphine. The evidence was overwhelming. Detectives reviewed hundreds of death certificates Shipman had signed. They found patterns, unusual numbers of patients dying shortly after visits from Dr. Shipman, medical records that had been altered after death to make the deaths seem expected. Primrose Shipman refused to believe it. She told investigators that Harold was innocent, that he was being framed. She stood by Harold publicly. When reporters asked her if she believed her husband was guilty, she said no. Their 4 children were devastated. Harold Shipman's trial began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. He was charged with 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery related to Kathleen Grundy's will. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, toxicology reports showing diamorphine in victims' bodies, medical records that had been falsified, the forged will, testimony from families of victims, computer records showing Shipman had accessed and altered patient files after their deaths to create false medical histories. The pattern was undeniable. Primrose attended the trial every day. She sat in the gallery watching her husband in the dock. She maintained that he was innocent. Even as the evidence piled up, even as expert after expert testified about the diamorphine, the forged records, the pattern of deaths, Primrose refused to believe Harold was guilty. On January 31, 2000, after deliberating for 6 days, the jury found Harold Shipman guilty on all 15 counts of murder. Judge Mr. Justice Forbes sentenced Shipman to life imprisonment on each count to run consecutively. The judge told Shipman, "You have finally been brought to justice for the wicked, evil crimes you committed." The judge recommended that Shipman never be released from prison. Shipman showed no emotion when the verdict was read. Primrose left the courtroom in tears. She still insisted Harold was innocent, that he had been wrongly convicted. After the trial, the British government launched the Shipman Inquiry to investigate the full extent of Harold Shipman's crimes. The inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, examined hundreds of deaths. It concluded that Harold Shipman had murdered at least 215 patients, with another 45 deaths considered suspicious but unproven. The true number may be as high as 250. The inquiry found that Shipman's killing spree had begun in 1975 and continued until his arrest in 1998. That was 23 years of systematic murder. The victims were overwhelmingly elderly women. Shipman's motive was unclear. He did not kill for money in most cases. The Kathleen Grundy murder was unusual because of the forged will. Psychiatrists suggested he killed for a sense of power and control, that playing God over life and death satisfied some deep psychological need. On January 13, 2004, Harold Shipman hanged himself in his cell at HMP Wakefield using bed sheets. He was 57 years old. He had been in prison for 4 years. He left no suicide note. He never confessed to the murders. He never showed remorse. His death meant he would never answer for all the victims, never explain why he did it. Primrose Shipman's life fell apart after Harold's conviction. She lost their home. She lost Harold's pension. She lived on state benefits. She moved frequently, trying to escape the media attention and the hatred directed at her. People blamed her. They could not understand how a wife could not know her husband was murdering hundreds of people. Primrose maintained that she had no idea. She said Harold kept his work life separate from their home life. She said she trusted him completely. For years, Primrose maintained Harold's innocence. She told her children their father had been wrongly convicted. When Harold died by suicide, Primrose was devastated. The Shipman children changed their surnames. They wanted nothing to do with the name Shipman. Primrose Shipman still lives in England, though her exact location is kept secret. She has never given a public interview. She has never publicly acknowledged Harold's guilt. According to people who have spoken to her, she continues to believe, or at least claims to believe, that Harold was innocent. She lives a quiet, isolated life, estranged from much of her family, carrying the weight of being married to Britain's most prolific serial killer. Primrose Shipman worked at her husband's medical practice for years. She scheduled the appointments that would end in murder. She filed the death certificates Harold signed after killing his patients. She heard him on the phone, offering condolences to families whose loved ones he had just murdered. She saw the names accumulate, one after another, year after year, and she never suspected. When police arrested Harold, when they exhumed the bodies and found the diamorphine, when the trial presented undeniable evidence of 15 murders, and the inquiry concluded he had killed at least 215 people, Primrose still could not accept it. The man she had married at 17, the man she had supported through medical school, the man she had raised 4 children with, could not be a monster. That was impossible, and so she chose to believe the impossible instead, that the entire British justice system had conspired against an innocent doctor. That belief allowed her to survive, but it also meant she spent the rest of her life living in a delusion, unable to face the truth that she had spent 32 years married to a man who murdered hundreds of people, while she sat at the front desk of his surgery, smiling at the patients who would soon be dead. Primrose Shipman's suspicions were never raised, even though her doctor husband's patients kept dying at rates far higher than any other physicians in Britain. But the next landlady didn't notice anything wrong, even though she was cashing social security checks for tenants who were already buried in her garden. Case 10. Boarders at 1426 F Street. In the autumn of 1988, several elderly and disabled individuals were living as tenants at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, California. The house was a large, well-maintained Victorian building painted in cheerful colours with a neatly kept garden in the backyard. It was a boarding house run by a 59-year-old woman named Dorothia Poente. Dorothea was a small, frail-looking woman who dressed elegantly, wore makeup carefully applied, and spoke softly to her tenants. She ran the boarding house as a business, renting rooms to elderly people, recovering alcoholics, and mentally disabled individuals who received Social Security or disability checks. Many of her tenants had nowhere else to go. They were vulnerable, often isolated from family, struggling with addiction or mental illness. Dorothea presented herself as a caretaker, someone who would provide them with a clean room, home-cooked meals, and a safe place to live. She seemed kind, almost grandmotherly. The tenants trusted her. They signed over their monthly checks to her, and she would give them a small allowance for personal expenses while she handled rent and food. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement. The tenants had no idea that the woman cooking their meals and collecting their checks had already murdered at least 3 of their fellow boarders and buried their bodies in the garden where she grew vegetables and flowers. They had no idea that the soil they walked on every day contained the decomposing remains of people who had lived in the same rooms they now occupied. And they had no idea that Dorothea was still cashing the Social Security checks of the dead, forging their signatures, pretending they were alive, while their corpses rotted beneath the rose bushes. Dorothea Helen Gray was born January 9, 1929 in Redlands, California. She had a difficult childhood, marked by poverty and instability. She married multiple times, using different names throughout her life. By the 1970s, she was living in Sacramento and had begun operating boarding houses for elderly and disabled individuals. On the surface, it seemed like charitable work, but Dorothea had a criminal history. In 1978, she was convicted of forging checks and sentenced to 5 years in prison. She served 3 years and was released in 1982. One of the conditions of her parole was that she was not allowed to handle other people's finances. Dorothea ignored this condition immediately. She returned to Sacramento and opened another boarding house at 1426 F Street. She began taking in tenants again, collecting their Social Security checks again, controlling their money again. And this time, when tenants became inconvenient, or when she wanted to keep collecting their checks after they were no longer useful to her, she killed them. Dorothea's first confirmed victim was Ruth Monroe, 61, who died on April 28, 1982, shortly after moving into the F Street boarding house. Ruth was found dead in her room. Dorothea called the paramedics. The death was attributed to an overdose of codeine and Tylenol. Dorothea claimed Ruth had been depressed and must have taken the pills herself. Nobody suspected Dorothea of involvement. Ruth's death was ruled a suicide. What investigators did not know at the time was that Dorothea had likely given Ruth the overdose, either by convincing her to take the pills or by slipping them into her food or drink. Between 1982 and 1988, Dorothea murdered at least 8 more people. Her method was consistent. She would drug her victims with sleeping pills mixed into food or drinks. Once they were unconscious or dead, she would bury their bodies in the yard. Then she would continue cashing their Social Security checks for months or even years, forging their signatures on the checks and on documents to make it appear they were still alive. If anyone asked about a missing tenant, Dorothea had a ready explanation. They had moved to live with family in another state. They had gone to Mexico. They had simply left without telling anyone. Because her tenants were transient, vulnerable people without strong family connections, their disappearances did not trigger immediate investigations. The other boarders living at 1426 F Street during this time noticed things, but they did not understand what they were noticing. Tenants would disappear. Dorothea would say they had moved away. Then new tenants would arrive and move into the same rooms. The garden was always being worked on. Dorothea hired a handyman named Ismael Flores to help her with various projects in the yard. Flores dug holes, moved soil, built raised garden beds, installed a concrete slab. He had no idea he was helping Dorothea bury bodies and cover burial sites. The borders sometimes smelled unpleasant odours coming from the yard, but Dorothea said it was fertiliser or compost. She grew vegetables and flowers. The smell seemed reasonable. Some tenants noticed that Dorothea received mail for people who no longer lived at the boarding house. Checks addressed to former tenants. When they asked about it, Dorothea explained she was forwarding the mail or handling final business for people who had moved. The explanations seemed plausible. Nobody suspected that the sweet elderly woman who cooked them meals was a murderer. In November 1988, social worker Judy Moyes became concerned about one of her clients, Alberto Montoya, 51, a mentally disabled man who had been living at Dorothea Poente's boarding house. Montoya had missed several appointments. Moyes went to 1426 F Street to check on him. Dorothea told Moyes that Montoya had gone to visit family in Mexico. Moyes did not believe her. Montoya had no family in Mexico. Moyes contacted the police. On November 11, 1988, Sacramento police officers arrived at 1426 F Street to investigate. Dorothea was cooperative. She invited them in, showed them around, answered their questions. She said Montoya had left weeks earlier. Officers looked around the property. They noticed freshly disturbed soil in the backyard. They asked permission to search the yard. Dorothea agreed. On November 11, 1988, police began excavating the yard at 1426 F Street. Within hours they found human remains, then more remains, then more. Over the next several days, investigators dug up the entire yard. They found 7 bodies buried in shallow graves throughout the garden. The bodies were in various states of decomposition. Some had been buried for years, others were more recent. Dorothea remained at the house during the initial excavation, calmly answering questions, making coffee for the officers, acting as if she had no idea how bodies ended up in her garden. On November 17, 1988, while police were still excavating, Dorothea asked if she could go to a nearby hotel to get a cup of coffee, because the noise and activity were overwhelming. Officers allowed her to leave. Dorothea walked to the Clarion Hotel, had a drink in the bar, then disappeared. She did not return. For 4 days, Dorothea Poente was a fugitive. Police launched a nationwide manhunt. Her photograph was shown on news programs across the country. On November 17, 1988, Dorothea was recognized by a man in a bar in Los Angeles, 400 miles south of Sacramento. The man had seen her on television. He called the police. Officers arrived and arrested Dorothea without incident. She was extradited back to Sacramento to face murder charges. By the time Dorothea was arrested, police had recovered a total of 7 bodies from the yard at 1426 F Street. The victims were identified as Leona Carpenter, 78, Dorothy Miller, 64, Benjamin Fink, 55, James Gallup, 62, Bert Montoya, 51, Betty Palmer, 78, Alvaro Montoya, also known as Bert Montoya, 51. Later, the body of Everson Gilmuth, 77, was found buried on the bank of the Sacramento River. He had been another one of Dorothea's victims, killed before the F Street murders. An additional body found in the yard was never identified. The boarders who had been living at 1426 F Street when police began excavating were evacuated from the property. They were questioned by investigators. They described living there, eating meals Dorothea prepared, walking through the garden, sleeping in rooms where other people had lived before them. They described how tenants would disappear, and Dorothea would say they had moved away. They had believed her. Why wouldn't they? She seemed kind, she took care of them. When they learned that the bodies being pulled from the garden were people who had lived in the same house, people who had eaten at the same table, people who had signed over their checks just like the current boarders had, the realization was devastating. Dorothea Poente's trial began in February 1993. She was charged with 9 counts of murder. The prosecution presented evidence that Dorothea had drugged her victims, buried them in the yard, and continued collecting their social security checks. Financial records showed that Dorothea had cashed thousands of dollars in checks for people who were already dead. Handwriting experts testified that signatures on the checks had been forged. The bodies found in the yard showed evidence of poisoning. Dorothea's defense attorneys argued that the victims had died of natural causes or drug overdoses, and that Dorothea had simply panicked and buried the bodies rather than reporting the deaths. The defense painted Dorothea as a woman trying to help society's most vulnerable people, not a calculating killer. On August 26, 1993, after deliberating for 24 days, the jury found Dorothea Poente guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder: Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. The jury could not reach a verdict on the other 6 charges, resulting in a hung jury on those counts. Judge Michael Verga sentenced Dorothea to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dorothea showed no emotion when the sentence was read. She was 64 years old. She would spend the rest of her life in prison. Dorothea Poente was sent to Central California Women's Facility in Chicatilo. She maintained her innocence for the rest of her life. She gave interviews from prison, always insisting she had not killed anyone, that the deaths were accidental, that she was being punished for trying to help people nobody else cared about. On March 27, 2011, Dorothea Poente died in prison of natural causes. She was 82 years old. She had served 18 years of her life sentence. The house at 1426 F Street still stands in Sacramento. After Dorothea's arrest, the property was seized. The yard was completely excavated and left barren. Eventually, the house was sold. It has changed hands multiple times. People have lived there since, though the house's history makes it a difficult property to rent or sell. The garden where 7 bodies were buried has been filled in, paved over, replanted. But everyone in Sacramento knows what that address means. The boarders who lived at 1426 F Street while Dorothea was murdering their fellow tenants had walked through a garden that was a graveyard. They had eaten food prepared by a woman who was poisoning others. They had slept in rooms where victims had lived before dying and being buried outside. They had trusted Dorothea because she seemed kind, because she provided them with shelter when they had nowhere else to go, because they were vulnerable and wanted to believe someone cared about them. When the truth came out, when police dug up the yard and found body after body, the surviving boarders had to reckon with the fact that they had been living on top of a mass grave. That Dorothea had been cashing checks for dead people while serving them dinner. That the woman who smiled at them every morning had murdered at least 3 people, and possibly as many as 9. The violation of trust was absolute. These were people who had already been marginalised, already struggled to find safe housing, already faced a world that did not value them, and the one person who seemed to offer them stability and care had been using them for their monthly checks and burying them in the garden when they were no longer profitable. If you enjoyed this deep dive into people who lived with serial killers and never knew, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.